cool opportunity. Let me try and share my screen here. Okay, can you all see that okay? Great. Yeah, so like Josh said, I'm a grad student at Cornell, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research I've been doing for my PhD on how birds are responding to restoration of old cattle pastures in Guatemala. Before I get into that, I'm gonna give a little bit of background on who I am and who my family is, and how I got interested in this kind of work. So this is my family on a walk at Fitzgerald Lake last fall. That's my brother Isaac to the left, and my dad David, and my mom Denise, who some of you have probably been birding with. My mom was into birds way before I was, and she loves birding around here, and she participates in the Christmas bird counts in Northampton, and she's been monitoring the kestrel nest boxes in Hadley for quite a while now. And yeah, so my brother and I grew up in Northampton, so it's nice to be able to talk here. And both of my parents are ecologists and conservationists, so the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. And we were always out hiking as a family when Isaac and I were little, whether it was exploring tide pools with my dad or learning about plants from my mom. And my mom was always trying to get me to wake up early to go birding with her when I was a teenager, which at that point in my life sounded like the worst idea in the world to get up early. So I didn't really get into birds until college. When, like Josh said, I got my first field job with birds working on saltmarsh sparrows in Maine. And I was pretty much immediately hooked. As soon as I took a bird out of the net and started nest searching, I was like, this is something I could see myself doing. So I spent the next 4 years doing seasonal field work all over the place. And two of the projects I got to work on really impacted me and kind of pushed me into what I'm doing now. So I went to Peru and looked at how the bird community changes along an elevational gradient from high to low elevations along the Manu Road, and then went to Borneo to look at the effects of selective logging on bird diversity. And both of those experiences made me care really deeply about land use change, especially in the tropics, and how it affects bird communities. So that's what I'm focusing on in grad school, where I look at how bird species and communities are responding to forest restoration in Guatemala. And that region, as some of you might know, faces multiple threats from agriculture, fire, and climate change. And so I'm looking at how regenerating cattle pastures can support forest bird species and how fire and rainfall seasonality affect the value of those restored habitats for birds. And I'm going to talk about the fire piece mostly today. So yeah, that brings me to what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to try to convince you about why tropical forest restoration is so important. And then I'll tell you a bit about the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala, where I work. It's one of the so-called 5 great forests of Mesoamerica, and it protects the largest tract of intact tropical forest north of the Amazon. So it's a really important area for conservation of birds and other wildlife. And then I'll get into some of the research that I'm doing on how tropical resident bird species are using naturally regenerating cattle pastures, and also how the growing threat of forest fires in the tropics might impact the value of these restored areas for birds. So why is restoration important? Forests cover 31% of the global land area, but only a third of that is actually primary undisturbed forest. And the rest is degraded or secondary, meaning that it's in the process of regrowing after being cut. And the rate of forest loss has slowed since 1990, but deforestation and forest degradation continue today at a pretty alarming rate. And the conversion of native habitats, including forests, to human land uses is still the #1 threat to biodiversity across the global tropics. And so protecting remaining old growth or primary forest is essential. We can't lose sight of protecting the intact forest that we have left. But given how much of global forest cover has already been lost or degraded, conservationists have kind of realized that protecting remnant forest isn't enough. So they're focusing more and more on forest restoration as a really important part of both biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation strategies. And the biggest example of this is the Bond Challenge, in which 61 countries around the world have collectively pledged to restore 350 million hectares of degraded and deforested land by 2030. And then the 20 by 20 initiative up at the top there, that's kind of under the umbrella of the Bond Challenge, but it's focused on the Western Hemisphere, so trying to restore 20 million hectares across Latin America. And so this kind of brings up the question of, is this focus on restoring degraded and deforested land worth it? Are second growth forests really able to support much biodiversity? And we know that the answer for older secondary forests, at least, is yes. So second growth forests benefit biodiversity in a number of ways. They make it easier for species that depend on mature forest to move among forest fragments in a fragmented landscape. They also provide good habitat per se for a lot of species, especially edge species or gap specialists. And studies that have compared secondary forests of different ages to primary forest have found that after just about 20 to 30 years, secondary forests can support the same number of species as primary forest. But not all species are the same, and so some species are much more sensitive to disturbance and really depend on nice, intact primary forest. And so those species tend not to return to regenerating forest for longer, on the order of about 60 to 150 years. So we know that older secondary forest that has been regenerating for many decades is valuable for bird diversity and other diversity. But we don't know as much about what value, if any, younger regenerating forests hold for bird diversity. So in some cases, those specialized primary forest birds have been found in very young regenerating forests, so 5 to 10 years old. But there's a lot of variation among studies, and there's not as much consensus about the value of young restored forests. And so that's what my research is trying to focus on. And an important thing to consider and remember is that forest restoration isn't happening in a vacuum. So restoration efforts, which can include assisted planting, so intentional planting of rows of trees, as you see here, or natural regeneration, where you maybe reclaim the land and then just let it go and regenerate naturally. So either of those restoration effort strategies are happening in the context of other environmental disturbances like climate change and forest fires. And like I mentioned today, I'm going to focus on fire as that other driver of environmental change. So fire is not historically a natural or frequent force in wet tropical forests. So there are drier ecosystems like those in the Western US that have been shaped by fire as a natural and frequent part of that ecosystem. But this hasn't historically been true for wet tropical forests. But you might remember from the news in 2019 that there was a ton of coverage of the forest fires in the Brazilian Amazon. And that reflects a trend of fire as an emerging threat to tropical forests globally. So this is happening everywhere in the tropics. And fire is increasing in both frequency and severity in the tropics for a number of reasons. One of those is the expansion of cattle ranching in tropical forests and other kinds of agriculture, which are often accompanied by burning. Forest fragmentation is another issue, so that makes forests more susceptible to fire by drying them out and increasing human access. And then climate change is increasing the occurrence of droughts in a lot of parts of the tropics. So fire is a really growing, increasingly important factor to consider when you're trying to look at the potential for restored agricultural lands to support bird diversity. And most of what we know so far about fire in the tropics is actually not in the context of restoration. So most of the studies have focused on how burning impacts otherwise undisturbed forest and its wildlife. And we know pretty much nothing about how fire affects the success of forest restoration. So that's what I'm looking at for part of my research, is how effective is forest restoration for birds in general, and then how does burning of regenerating forest areas impact its value for different bird species. So we're looking at these questions in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in northern Guatemala. So some of you might have been there or heard of it. I actually hadn't heard about the Maya Biosphere Reserve until I got to grad school, which is kind of surprising to me now, given how important it is. So just to situate you geographically, can you all see my pointer? I'm gonna assume that you can. So this is Guatemala here. Oops, it disappeared. Well, okay, so this is Guatemala here, bordered by Mexico and Belize, and then Honduras and El Salvador to the south. And the green part of the map here is the Petén, which is the state in the north that the Maya Biosphere Reserve is in. And then the Maya Biosphere Reserve itself is inside this red box. And like I mentioned, that reserve protects one of the 5 great forests of Central America. And so one of them is here. This is the Maya forest, and that actually spans Guatemala, Mexico, and Belize. And there's actually some talk of creating a trinational reserve to sort of increase protection of that forest. If you're into archaeology or Star Wars, you might recognize the top picture. So that's part of Tikal National Park, which is the most famous city built by the Mayan civilization thousands of years ago. And today it's a really big tourist destination and was a filming location for one of the Star Wars movies. So might look kind of familiar. So the Maya Biosphere Reserve was first established in 1990, and it's really big. It covers 20 million hectares of forest. But unfortunately, forest loss has continued since the reserve was established. So all of the red that you can see in the map to the left is actually forest cover that's been lost over the past 30 years. And 90% of that recent loss has been due to illegal cattle ranching. And kind of in response to this, the Guatemalan Park Service started a pilot restoration program about a decade ago to reclaim, protect, and restore a subset of these cattle pastures. And they're trying to see how effective natural, so not assisted forest restoration could be for supporting forest birds. So this blue circle here is where they've been doing this pilot program, and these are where our study sites are. So this inset here, these red polygons are the pastures that we're working in. And so when I say natural restoration, I mean that they're not planting trees. So they're just protecting these reclaimed agricultural areas from further use so that they can grow back to forest on their own. The reserve is critically important for wildlife, including birds. So some of you may have heard about that paper that came out in Science last year that reported a net loss of 3 billion birds across North America since 1970. And this is a pretty catastrophic loss that has kind of rocked the bird science and conservation world and gotten a lot of people to start thinking about why this is happening and what's wrong with our conservation efforts that they haven't been as effective as we would like them to be. And I won't get too much into that. I'm happy to talk about it more later in the questions, but I mostly bring it up because a lot of the declining North American species are migratory birds that overwinter in Central and South America. And these birds' wintering habitats are really critically important for their survival and also for reproductive success when they come back to the breeding grounds. And most of these migratory species, as you all know, spend between 7 to 9 months out of the year not on their breeding grounds where we typically see them and think about them, but on their non-breeding grounds in Latin America. And the Maya Biosphere Reserve is a really important part of the non-breeding range for a lot of species. So an example is Baltimore oriole that mostly winters in Central America, and the Maya Biosphere Reserve is a pretty sizable portion of that wintering range. Magnolia warbler is even more concentrated in Central America, particularly the Yucatan Peninsula and the Maya Biosphere Reserve. This is definitely the most common warbler that we have when I'm there during the winter. So they're all over our sites and really dependent on this area. And then you can see it even more starkly for Kentucky warblers. So I don't know, well, this probably isn't as apparent to people who haven't spent hours looking at aerial maps of these areas, but you can see that where this bird winters, it really fully overlaps with the remnant forest that's there in the Maya Biosphere Reserve and in Mexico in other reserves. And so this bird really depends on intact forest over the winter. And so, yeah, the Maya Biosphere Reserve is a really, really important part of its range. And the reserve is not only valuable for North American migratory birds, but also for these really spectacular local resident bird species of high conservation concern. So these are just a few of the gorgeous resident species that depend on the Maya forest. Ocellated turkey is up in the top right. I like to think of that one as a cross between our turkey here and a peacock. It's just amazing with those really cool eye markings and sort of orange dots on its head. And then toady motmot is up at the top left. It's a very tiny motmot species, pretty secretive and hard to come across. Chestnut colored woodpecker on the bottom left is a really beautiful local woodpecker species. And then of course in the bottom right is red-capped manakin that probably some of you know. And I'm gonna see if this works. I'm gonna try to show a video of it dancing. Let's see. I'm gonna do a new share. There we go. Yeah, so I love that Michael Jackson bird. Hopefully it showed up for everyone there. Let me just get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully that's showing up again. So yeah, this reserve is also really important for these incredible resident species, many of which are threatened. And I know, oops, there we go, back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and I know that we mostly care about birds in this crowd, but the reserve is also a stronghold for other charismatic species like jaguar, tapir, tara, which is this kind of Wolverine-looking mammal in the bottom, and peccaries. So really important for many, many, many species and for biodiversity in general. And this is just a little bit about what the reserve looks like. So the buildings on the top right there are from the island town of Flores, which is where I stay on my days off. And it's a really beautiful tourist destination and kind of a stopover point for people going to Tikal or doing ecotourism in the area. And then the top right is kind of an idea of what the actual forest looks like. So it's a really interesting and unique forest type. It's really dominated by palms, and it's not a fully wet tropical rainforest like you would find in southern Central America or South America. So it's actually classified as humid tropical forest. So it's kind of between the wetter tropical rainforest to the south and then the scrubby dry forest in the Yucatan Peninsula. And so it is a little bit more water limited than some other forests in Latin America. And it's also water limited, not only because of the amount of rainfall, but also because of its limestone geology. So the bedrock is all limestone, which means that the rain that it does get, the limestone is really porous, and so it tends to kind of run off into the ground. And so there aren't really a lot of large rivers in the area of the reserve where we're working. And so this kind of nice pool here is actually pretty rare. And this whole area is pretty water limited. So a pretty distinct, drawn out dry season. And I can't talk about any of this work that I'm about to talk about without mentioning my field crew. So everyone that I work with there is local, they're from the Petén. And after spending almost a year total with them in the field, they feel more like family than coworkers. And none of this work would or could happen without them. So I just want to take a minute to introduce them all. So on the top left is Chalo. He's kind of my point person when I'm there. He works for the Wildlife Conservation Society in Guatemala. And he's amazing. He's dedicated his life to bird conservation and forest conservation and to educating young people there about birds and about the importance of conserving their birds. And he knows everyone in the community. And so he's a big part of the reason that we've been accepted into the communities where we work and sort of allowed to stay and work there. And the top right is his truck, which is how we get around the field sites. And then the bottom right are Kevin and Emmett, two of my field techs. And then to the left, I'm there with Desley and Melvin. And they are all really amazing birders. They took an Audubon course a couple of years ago, many years ago now, in bird ID. And so that really got them started. And Chalo trained them, and they are so passionate about birding. They love doing it in their free time, and they're really good at IDing birds. And they have taught me all about the birds there. And then they also just know a lot more about the forest and sort of how to operate there than I do. And so it's been really amazing to work with them. And they've been at least as much a part of making this project happen as I have. And this is just some other examples of things that they've taught me and both of my parents in the field. So the top left is when my mom and dad came and visited, and they were teaching us how to make corn tortillas, which are a completely indispensable part of the diet there. So you cannot eat a single meal without tortillas. And so we spent a lot of time in the field after work making them. And this is Desley and Kevin at the bottom doing a much better and faster job, and some of the fruits of their labor on the bottom right here. Beautiful stack of tortillas. These fruits in the middle here, this is a cool plant that my field techs have taught me about. So some of them work as ecotourism guides in Tikal when they're not working with me. And so this husk here is from a fruit called copal, and if you squeeze it, it exudes this sort of sharp but sweet, really nice smelling oil. And they told me that the Mayans used to use that in ceremonies to burn. And here I am with my mom and dad. They came and visited me, and here we are in Tikal. And that picture kind of makes it look like it was just a nice, relaxing vacation for them. But my dad almost died coming out to work with us in the field one day. So the forest there is pretty tangled. There are a lot of vines and thorns, and it's really hard to just move through the forest. So when we're going to count birds, you actually have to use a machete to cut a little walking trail. And my dad came out with us one really hot afternoon to do that. And we didn't bring enough water. And so he almost died of heat stroke and dehydration. And my field tech, Kevin, kind of got him through by showing him this big vine that you can cut with a machete, and it actually has pure, clean water that you can drink inside. So yeah, they've just showed us a lot of really cool things about the forest as well, working there. And here are some pictures of us actually working. So all of the data that I'm gonna talk about in a minute is just from point counts. So from going out like you do in the Christmas bird counts and counting birds by sight and sound. But this past season, we actually did some mist netting too. And so these are just some pictures of us training, teaching each other how to measure birds. And then my mom actually came down for that and helped us out with some of the mist netting. So here she is holding a blue bunting, which is a really beautiful forest species. So now that you have a bit of an idea about what the reserve is like and what life in the field is like, I'm going to talk about some of the research questions that I've been asking in this system. So I'm going to talk about a couple of questions. First is, to what extent do resident bird species in this system use young regenerating pastures? So like I mentioned, restoration of these pastures started about a decade ago. So the oldest regenerating forest here is about 12 years old. So I wanted to look at how many of these local bird species that mostly evolved in intact mature forest are able to use these relatively young restored agricultural lands. Second, do species use pastures differently depending on how advanced the vegetation regrowth is at a local scale within pastures? And I'll explain more about what I mean about that in a minute. And then finally, how does burning affect species' ability to use regenerating pastures in the short term, so over the first 5 months after fire? Do species use pastures more, less, or the same after fire? And is it different for different kinds of species? And so just to explain a little bit about the fire piece, so looking at fire was not actually in my plan as a research question before starting fieldwork. So we weren't expecting the pastures to burn in 2019 when we started our field season. And when they started burning, they sort of burned sequentially. And when that started, I thought that my field sites had been destroyed and that I might have to change projects or something. But what started out as a bit of a disaster actually turned into an interesting research project because not all of the pastures burned. And so we were able to look at differences in how species used pastures that burned and species that didn't burn, or pastures that didn't burn, excuse me. And then because we surveyed all of the pasture sites at least once before they burned, we also could compare species' use of regenerating pastures prior to burning to their use after. So first question, how are species using restored pastures, and do species respond to local vegetation regrowth stage? So what do I mean by that, by vegetation regrowth stage? So as pastures regenerate, as they get older, they go through a process of vegetation succession from open and grass dominated to closed canopy towards a mature forest-like structure. So these are aerial photos of individual sites, and they show what the vegetation looks like from above within about 100-meter radius around each site. So when I talk about local scale vegetation stage, that 100-meter radius around individual sites is what I mean by local. And the pastures themselves range from about 600 to 800 hectares, so really large. And the amount of regrowth can vary a lot within a given pasture. The pastures are pretty heterogeneous in terms of vegetation structure. So I'm looking at how species are responding to local vegetation structure at a small scale around survey sites within these much larger pastures. So initially, right after restoration begins, most pasture sites are pretty open and dominated by grass, like in the image you can see on the left. And then vegetation, even at this small scale, starts to grow back kind of patchily, like you can see in the second photo there. So you get shrubs and small trees coming back first. And then the third picture is what a pasture can look like after about 8 to 10 years of regeneration, when it has been successfully protected from burning and allowed to regrow uninterrupted. And you can see there that it pretty much looks like a forest at that point. But the picture to the right is an actual mature forest site. And you can see that in both of them, there's closed canopy, but in the picture to the right, the crowns of the trees are bigger. So they are a bit different in terms of structure. And this is an idea of what that vegetation succession looks like from the ground level. So again, to the left is an early stage grass dominated site. In the middle is an intermediate stage with some shrubby regrowth, but still some gaps in the canopy. And then to the right is an older pasture site dominated by palms and some woody trees. So I wanted to look at how species are using regenerating pastures in relation to these local scale vegetation characteristics. Do all species in the resident bird community prefer older, more advanced forest-like vegetation? And does the degree to which they use regenerating pastures depend on these local characteristics of vegetation at all, or are they responding to another habitat attribute entirely? So it turns out that a surprising diversity of species that evolved in forest are using these regenerating pastures even during the first decade of regrowth. So these are some of the species that you find in regenerating pastures within the first decade. Yellow-faced grassquit up at the top, top middle, gray-throated chat, black-faced ant thrush on the top right, which is a terrestrial insectivore that is really specialized on insects and just walks along the forest floor. My personal favorite on the bottom right, northern bentbill, which is a very small species with a very loud voice. Lesson's motmot is in the bottom middle there, and barred antshrike is a really beautiful striking species on the bottom left. And so all of these species are found in these regenerating pastures within the first 10 years of restoration. And so the results that I'm going to show focus on species like these that you do find in regenerating pastures. Keep in mind that there are plenty of species in this system that are restricted to mature forest and don't really enter these regenerating pastures at all. And just some examples of these are scaly-throated leaf tosser, white-necked puffbird on the bottom left here, northern barred wood creeper, and ruddy-tailed flycatcher, which is also very small. So these are species that are pretty restricted to mature forest. But for species that do use these regenerating pastures during the first decade of regrowth, we found that many species did respond really strongly to local vegetation stage around sites, but in different ways depending on the species. So something interesting is that even though prior to disturbance by cattle ranching, the native habitat in this region was closed canopy mature forest, not all of the species here preferred the more forest-like vegetation within regenerating pastures. So these next few graphs show how species are using regenerating pastures in relation to that local vegetation stage. So on the x-axis is NDVI, which is a metric that remotely senses vegetation stage. And so the early grass-dominated vegetation that I showed pictures of is to the left, and then the further to the right you get on the x-axis, the more forest-like enclosed canopy the vegetation is. And then the x-axis is a measure of habitat use. So a higher value on this axis means that the species is using that type of habitat more. And so for these 11 species, they strongly prefer young, open, grass-dominated habitat and decline pretty steeply at sites with more advanced vegetation. And these species include blue-black grassquit, which is pictured here, which is a seed eater and really likes areas dominated by grass. Many species in this community actually specialize on intermediate stages of vegetation regrowth, where the habitat is dominated by shrubs and small trees. So again, more open habitat to the left, more advanced forest-like habitat to the right, and these species are all preferring habitat that's somewhere in the middle. Gray-throated chat is an example of these species pictured here. So rather than open and grassy or advanced enclosed canopy, they're preferring something in the middle. And then a third set of species strongly preferred more advanced forest-like vegetation. So they used regenerating pastures, but only when the vegetation around a site approaches a more forest-like structure. And one of these species is red-throated ant tanager, which is a species that's an important leader of mixed species bird flocks. So some of you might know that mixed species flocks are a really important part of bird communities in the tropics. So these are groups of birds that forage together and often follow army ant swarms to take advantage of the insects, the other insects that those ant swarms scare up. And so these are birds that you typically find more in mature forest, but some of these species are able to move into these relatively young regenerating pastures and use them. But within those pastures, they're really gravitating towards the points that have vegetation that's more similar to forest. And yeah, so you can see that there are a lot of resident species that are used to this intact tropical forest because that's the native habitat that they evolved in, but they do start using these regenerating cattle pastures very quickly within the first decade of regrowth. And some species prefer sites with early stage vegetation, some prefer intermediate growth stages, and some prefer that more advanced forest-like regrowth. So now that we have an idea of how different species in the bird community are using these pastures, we asked whether species' likelihood of using pastures changed after those pasture sites burned over the first 5 months after burning. So we surveyed all of these sites before they burned, and then we kept surveying them for 5 months after they burned. And so we were able to look at the change in use for different species from pre-burning through 5 months post-burning. And I don't know about you all, but I expected fire to negatively affect most species in the community, particularly because tropical forest species are not adapted to dealing with fire. So there are some species in North America that do depend on fire and actually prefer areas that have been recently burned, some woodpecker species out west. But here I expected most species to respond negatively because they're not used to fire as a natural ecological phenomenon. But actually, species responded to fire in both directions, with some using regenerating pasture sites more post-burning and others using them less and declining in pastures after they burned. So these are two single species examples of how species responded to burning. So the x-axes here are the number of months since burning. So the first point over here is pre-burn, and then as you get further to the right, that's more time since burning, out to 5 months after burning. And you can just ignore these other discrete points to the right here for now. So just look at the curve. And so the y-axis, again, like in those earlier graphs, is the degree of habitat use. So lower values on this axis mean less use, and when there are higher values, it means a species is using them more. So this is how species used burned pasture sites before they burned through 5 months after they burned. And so blue-black grassquit on the left is a species that actually increased a lot in these pasture sites after they burned. Black-headed trogon, on the other hand, is a species that used these regenerating pastures quite a lot prior to burning, but decreased pretty substantially in regenerating pastures after they burned. So the surprising thing to me, excuse me, I'm gonna get some water, was that of the species that showed strong responses to fire, more species actually showed positive responses to fire than negative responses. So this graph is showing how a larger suite of species responded to fire over those first 5 months. So each colored line in this case represents a single species. And the distance from that horizontal black line shows how much each species increased or decreased their use of pastures after fire. So points that are further to the right of the line increased more in pastures after fire, whereas species to the left of this black line decreased in pastures after fire. And pictured here are the two species that responded most positively and most negatively. So ladder-backed woodpecker on top really gravitated towards burned areas and increased in burned pasture sites a lot in those first 5 months, whereas red-throated ant tanager is another species that used these regenerating pastures before burning, but declined really dramatically after burning. And Something that I wanted to know is whether the direction of species responses to burning, so whether they increased or decreased their use of these regenerating pastures after fire, was related to their preference for vegetation stage, like I talked about before, so early, intermediate, or advanced vegetation growth stage. And I expected that species that preferred that open grass-dominated habitat type might be more resilient to fire or even prefer pastures after burning because fire tends to stall and sort of reset the process of vegetation regrowth. And the color of the lines here represent those preferences. So species that are colored in red preferred open grass dominated habitat at that local scale. Species in green preferred intermediate vegetation stage. And then species that are colored in blue here preferred older, more forest-like vegetation. And what you can see here is that there's really no relationship between species responses to fire and whether they preferred early, intermediate, or late vegetation regrowth. So species that preferred all three stages are represented to the right of the horizontal black line, meaning that they used pastures more after burning. And similarly, you can see that species that responded negatively to fire include species that preferred early, intermediate, and older vegetation. So what are the takeaways here? So many species in this system do use young regenerating pastures. So they do have some pretty good value from a conservation standpoint, even after just about a decade of regeneration. And the species that are using these pastures showed a range of preferences for local vegetation stage. So even though the native forest type that they evolved in is mostly closed canopy forest, there are some species in this community that prefer more open areas, some that prefer that kind of shrubby, scrubby vegetation, and some that really need more advanced vegetation. And in the short term, over those first 5 months, some species increased use of pastures after fire while others decreased, which was pretty surprising. I expected most species to decline in these burned pastures after fire. And then finally, species responses to burning over time were unrelated to their preference for early, intermediate, or advanced vegetation. This isn't the whole story, so I'm not going to have time to get into this tonight, but I do want to mention it so you don't sort of go away from this thinking that fire is all good and that it's not a problem for these tropical species and for restoration of forest. So even though many species did respond positively to burning in that short term, there are plenty of other species that don't use those burned pastures at all. So I mentioned before that something else that we compared was how species use pastures that burned during our 2019 field season to regenerating pasture sites that didn't burn. And there are a lot of species that are able to use regenerating pasture sites that did not burn, but they were excluded from pastures that burned. And we think that what's going on here is that the pasture sites that burned when we were there, they burned in 2019, but those same sites have probably been burning intermittently over the entire decade of restoration. And so there's kind of this short-term response to fire over 5 months, but then there are also longer-term responses to this repeated burning in which some species are actually just completely excluded from points that have burned multiple times. And so burning does seem to reduce the value of regenerating pastures for many species, and we found that this is particularly true for species of higher conservation concern. And I'm hopefully going to be coming out with a paper about this soon, so if you're more interested in that second part of the story, definitely I can send that to the group or something when it eventually comes out. So with that, thank you for listening. And I just want to say thank you to my advisor, Amanda, and to my committee, particularly Viviana Ruiz Gutierrez, who has worked really closely with me on this project. I want to thank all of my Guatemalan collaborators, especially my field techs who I mentioned, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, which has been really supportive, as well as the Park Service there at CONAP, and a couple of collaborators I've been working with pretty closely there. And my funders, including the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Yeah, and thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen for now.